That day was supposed to be the happiest of her life. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden glow over the outdoor ceremony. Rows of white chairs were neatly arranged. Guests dressed in their finest sat eagerly, waiting for the moment when the bride would walk down the aisle. Soft music played in the background, blending with the quiet rustling of leaves in the gentle breeze. It was a picture-perfect wedding, every detail carefully planned, every moment leading up to this day meticulously thought out. But no one could have planned for what happened next. As the bride stood at the end of the aisle, her heart pounding in anticipation, a sudden murmur rippled through the crowd. At first, she thought it was just nerves, the kind that made her chest tighten with excitement. But then she saw them, her guests turning their heads, whispering, pointing. Some even gasped. Then she heard it, the soft padding of paws against the grass. A dog had wandered into the ceremony. The bride blinked, confused. Where had it come from? It wasn't a stray. Its fur was clean, its eyes bright, and full of something she couldn't quite place. The dog trotted forward, completely unbothered by the curious stares around it. It wasn't just passing by. It was coming straight toward her. The groom turned, his brow furrowed. A few guests chuckled awkwardly, assuming the dog belonged to someone in the crowd. But as it got closer, a hush fell over the ceremony. Something about the way this dog carried itself, the way it looked at the bride. It was almost purposeful. And then she saw it. A collar snug around its neck. A simple tag dangling from it, catching the light. Her breath caught in her throat. The moment she read the words engraved on the tag, her hands flew to her mouth. Her eyes widened, her heart hammering. This wasn't just any dog. It was him. And in that instant, the world around her seemed to blur. The wedding, the guests, the music, they all faded into the background. Because this dog had a story, and it was a story that changed everything. The bride's hands trembled as she reached out, her fingers barely brushing against the tag hanging from the dog's collar. Her heart pounded so loudly she could barely hear the whispers around her. Her vision blurred as she struggled to focus on the tiny, engraved letters. She knew this name. A rush of memories flooded her mind, hitting her all at once. Laughter echoing through an old backyard, the warmth of soft fur against her cheek, the sound of tiny paws scrambling across a wooden floor. The feeling of unconditional love, of companionship that had once felt like it would last forever. But that was impossible, because this dog, this very dog standing before her, had been gone for years. Her lips parted, but no words came out. She could barely breathe. The groom stepped closer, concern creasing his forehead. "Do you know this dog?" His voice was quiet, cautious. The bride swallowed hard, her eyes still locked onto the collar. She barely nodded. "Yes," she whispered. A few guests leaned in, their curiosity growing. Others exchanged confused glances. The officiant, who had been standing patiently at the front, now looked unsure of what to do. The entire wedding had come to a halt. The dog just stood there, watching her, its tail giving a slow, hesitant wag, as if it was waiting. She crouched down, her dress pooling around her, ignoring the whispers around her. With shaking hands, she carefully turned the tag over. And there, beneath the name she could never forget, was something even more shocking. A date. A date that shouldn't be there. A date from years ago. The day he had disappeared. Her stomach twisted. She felt lightheaded, as if the ground beneath her had suddenly become unsteady. This wasn't possible. It couldn't be. She had searched for him. She had cried for him. She had accepted that he was never coming back. And yet, here he was, standing before her, alive, as if nothing had ever happened. The groom placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Are you okay?" he asked softly. She blinked, snapping back to the present, but her mind was still spinning. I don't understand," she murmured. She looked up at him, searching his face for some kind of answer, but he was just as confused as she was. The dog took a step closer, pressing his nose against her hand, his warm breath tickling her skin. The familiar scent, the way he looked at her, it was all the same. A lump formed in her throat. If this was real, if this was actually happening, then where had he been all this time? And why had he come back now? A sudden gust of wind rustled the trees, making the fabric of her veil flutter behind her. The sun had started to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the grass. It should have been a beautiful, peaceful moment, but instead, an eerie silence settled over the ceremony. No one knew what to say. The bride slowly rose to her feet, still clutching the tag in her hand. Her mind raced with questions she couldn't even begin to answer. Something wasn't right. Something about this felt unreal. But the weight of the dog's gaze kept pulling her back. It was like he was trying to tell her something, like he had come back for a reason. And suddenly, she wasn't sure if she wanted to know what it was. The air around her felt heavier, charged with something she couldn't name. The world had shifted in an instant, turning what was supposed to be the happiest day of her life into something else entirely. She had thought she was prepared for this day, but nothing could have prepared her for this. The dog didn't move. He stood there, his deep brown eyes locked onto hers, full of something she couldn't quite understand. It wasn't just recognition, it was something deeper, something almost knowing. The guests remained frozen in their seats, whispering among themselves. Some exchanged puzzled glances. Others took out their phones, uncertain if they were witnessing something beautiful or something unsettling. The bride's fingers traced over the engraved date once more, as if touching it might change the reality before her. But it didn't. It was still there, as clear as day. The date, he had vanished. The weight of it pressed down on her, making her feel dizzy. She looked back at the dog, her mind racing. Where had he been all these years? Who had been taking care of him? How had he found his way here, on this day of all days? The groom cleared his throat softly beside her. Maybe someone found him and he hesitated, glancing at the tag. Maybe they just never changed it, but even he didn't sound convinced. The dog sat down, tail resting still against the grass, watching her like he was waiting for something. She swallowed hard. "I don't understand," she whispered. Then, from somewhere in the back, a voice broke through the murmurs. "Excuse me." Everyone turned. A man stood near the last row of chairs, dressed in a dark suit, his hands clasped in front of him. His face was weathered, lined with age, but his eyes were sharp, watching the scene unfold with quiet intensity. The bride had never seen him before. The man took a slow step forward, his gaze flicking between her and the dog. "That's quite a moment you're having there," he said, his voice calm but unreadable. The groom stiffened slightly. "Do you know this dog?" he asked, his protective instinct kicking in. The man's lips pressed together, as if considering his words carefully. Then, after a pause, he nodded. "I do." A wave of shock rippled through the crowd again. The bride's breath caught. "What?" The man took another step closer, his expression unreadable. "He's been with me for the last few years." Her heartbeat pounded in her ears. "That's not possible," she said, shaking her head. "This is my dog. He went missing years ago. I searched everywhere for him." The man exhaled slowly, as if he had been expecting this reaction. "I didn't steal him, if that's what you're thinking," he said gently. "He came to me." The bride's eyes narrowed. "Came to you? What does that mean?" The man looked at the dog, his face softening slightly. "One night, a few years back, I found him wandering alone on the outskirts of town. He was thin, exhausted, like he'd been running for days." Her stomach twisted. She could picture it too clearly. The dog she had loved, lost and alone, searching for something. "I took him in," the man continued. "He had no identification except for that tag. I checked with shelters, put up notices, but no one came forward." He let out a small sigh. "So he stayed." The bride stared at him, her mind spinning. "I never saw any notices," she said quietly. The man hesitated. "That's the thing," he admitted. "I don't think he wanted to be found." A strange, cold feeling settled in her chest. "What are you talking about?" The man's gaze flicked back to the dog. "I know it sounds crazy, but..." He shook his head. "He was looking for something, or someone. Every time I took him somewhere new, he'd stop, stare, like he was searching. But he never found it." Her throat tightened. "So why now?" The man's eyes softened. "I don't know," he admitted, "but he ran off last week. I looked everywhere, but he was gone." He glanced around at the wedding. "And now he's here." The silence that followed was deafening. The dog remained perfectly still, waiting. Watching, the bride felt something deep inside her shift. It was like a thread she hadn't even known was loose had suddenly pulled tight. This wasn't just a coincidence. This wasn't random. He had come back, and he had come back today. The groom exhaled sharply, rubbing his jaw. "Okay," he said, forcing a small, uneasy laugh. "This is a lot." The bride barely heard him. Her fingers curled against the fabric of her dress, her mind swimming with thoughts she couldn't make sense of. She had accepted the loss, mourned it, moved on. So why did it feel like the past wasn't finished with her yet? And why did she have the strangest feeling that this moment, this dog, this return, was about more than just an old pet finding his way home? Something wasn't right. And deep down, she knew it. The bride couldn't tear her eyes away from the dog. He sat still, his posture calm, but there was something in the way he watched her, something expectant, something urgent. Her heart pounded as she tried to process everything. The man's story didn't make sense. If someone had really found her dog, why hadn't she ever heard about it? Why now? Why today? The guests were still whispering, shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Some looked amused, others concerned, but no one spoke loud enough to break the strange, charged silence hanging over the wedding. Even the officiant, who had been standing patiently this entire time, seemed at a loss for what to do. The groom sighed beside her, running a hand through his hair. "Look, I don't want to sound insensitive, but we're in the middle of our wedding. He gestured vaguely at the dog, at the man, at everything unraveling around them, is a little much right now." The bride barely heard him. Her fingers twitched at her sides as a familiar ache crept into her chest. She had spent years searching, crying, wondering what had happened to him. She had walked through the neighborhood for weeks, calling his name, leaving flyers on every street corner. She had imagined every terrible possibility. And now, just when she had stopped looking, he had found her. It didn't feel like an accident. She took a slow breath, forcing herself to meet the older man's gaze. "Where exactly did you find him?" she asked. The man hesitated, shifting slightly on his feet. "Like I said, outside of town," he answered. "Near the old park." Her stomach dropped. The old park. A memory slammed into her so hard she had to grip the edge of her dress to steady herself. That was the last place she had searched before she gave up. The last place she had gone before she accepted he was never coming home. She had walked through the overgrown grass, calling his name until her voice was hoarse. She had sat on the swings, staring at the empty space beside her, waiting, hoping. And then she swallowed hard. She didn't want to remember what had happened next. The groom placed a hand on her arm. "Babe," he said, his voice softer now. "Are you okay?" She blinked at him, suddenly aware of the way her body was trembling. But she didn't answer. Something about this didn't feel real. It felt like a dream, like she had stepped into a moment she wasn't meant to relive. The dog whined softly, shifting on his paws. The bride exhaled, glancing back at him. He looked so much like he used to, and yet there was something different. It wasn't just the way he had appeared out of nowhere, or the fact that he had been missing for so long. It was the way he had found her, the way he had waited, like he was here for a reason. The man cleared his throat, stepping forward. "Look, I don't mean to interrupt your big day," he said carefully, "but I think there's something you should know." The bride stiffened. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. The groom tensed beside her. "What?" The man hesitated again, his gaze flicking between them. His expression was unreadable, but his voice was steady when he spoke. "I don't think he ever stopped looking for you," he said. The bride felt her breath hitch. The man continued, his voice quieter now. "Every time we went for a walk, he pulled me in the same direction. Every time we passed that park, he stopped, sat there for hours, waiting for something." He sighed, shaking his head. "I thought it was just a habit, a memory stuck in his head. But now," his eyes met hers. "Now I'm not so sure." A chill ran down her spine. The guest had fallen completely silent now. No one moved. No one spoke. The dog took a slow step forward, closing the last bit of space between them. And then, just as she reached out to touch him, he did something that made her blood turn cold. He turned his head, just slightly, toward the trees beyond the wedding arch, and growled. Low, deep, a warning. The bride's breath caught. Her eyes darted to the tree line, her pulse hammering in her ears. There was nothing there, just shadows stretching across the grass as the sun continued its slow descent. But something inside her told her he wasn't growling at nothing. The tension in the air became unbearable, and in that moment she knew this wasn't over, not even close. The bride's breath hitched as the dog's growl deepened, low and steady. His body stiffened, ears pricked, gaze locked on the trees beyond the wedding arch. A cold shiver crept up her spine. The groom followed her gaze, frowning. "What is it?" he whispered. She didn't answer. She wasn't sure she could. The guests shifted in their seats, sensing the shift in energy. A few glanced over their shoulders at the trees, their curiosity turning into unease. The officiant, who had been silent through the entire strange ordeal, cleared his throat as if trying to bring the moment back to its intended purpose. But no one was paying attention to the ceremony anymore. The dog took another step forward, standing protectively in front of her. His tail was rigid, his stance unwavering. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the growling stopped. The bride barely had time to process it before he turned his head back to her, his deep brown eyes locking onto hers again. But this time, something had shifted in them. The urgency, the tension, it was gone. Instead, there was something almost peaceful. Her heart pounded as she knelt, her wedding dress pooling around her feet. Slowly, hesitantly, she reached out. This time, he didn't hesitate. He leaned in her touch, pressing his head against her palm, a familiar warmth spreading through her fingers. A soft gasp escaped her lips. It was real. He was real. A lump formed in her throat as she buried her fingers in his fur, feeling the solid weight of him, the warmth of his body. For the first time since he had appeared, she let herself believe it. Her dog had come home. Tears welled in her eyes as she whispered his name, her voice breaking. He let out a soft, familiar huff, as if to say, "I never forgot you." The world around her blurred. The wedding, the guests, the murmurs, it all faded into the background. Then, she felt a hand on her shoulder. She looked up to see the groom watching her carefully, his expression unreadable. He glanced at the dog, then back at her. "Are you okay?" he asked softly. She swallowed hard, nodding. But deep down, she wasn't sure what okay even meant anymore. The older man sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Looks like he found what he was looking for," he said quietly. The bride blinked, her fingers still tangled in the dog's fur. The way he said it made her stomach twist in a way she didn't understand. "What do you mean?" she asked. The man hesitated, glancing at the trees again before exhaling. "I think he knew this moment was coming," he admitted. "I don't know how, but I think he was meant to be here today." A silence settled between them. The bride looked back at her dog, searching his eyes for answers she wasn't sure she'd ever find. Had he been looking for her all these years? Had something led him back to her on this day of all days? Or had he always known? The guests, sensing the moment had shifted, began murmuring again, some standing, others still watching in quiet awe. The officiant hesitated before finally stepping forward, clasping his hands together. "Well," he said, clearing his throat, "this has certainly been an unexpected turn of events." A small, nervous chuckle rippled through the crowd. "But if the bride and groom are ready, we can continue." The words felt distant, like they belonged to another reality. The groom sighed, glancing at the dog once more before looking at her. "What do you want to do?" he asked. She opened her mouth to answer, but for the first time in her life, she didn't know. This was supposed to be the happiest day of her life. But now, standing here with her lost dog by her side, something inside her felt different. The past and the present had collided in a way she never could have expected. And suddenly, she wasn't sure which direction her future was supposed to take. The dog nudged her hand gently, grounding her. She took a shaky breath, looking around. At her groom, at the guests, at the man who had cared for her dog when she couldn't. Then, finally, she looked at the wedding arch, the place where she was supposed to take the next step in her life. For the first time, she wondered if it was truly the path she was meant to walk. And in that moment, she realized this wasn't just about a dog finding his way home. It was about something much bigger. It was about fate. And fate had just given her a choice.